Hello, I am Paul Drinkwater. I am a guide with the Gloucester Civic Trust, and in this talk I want to tell you about the history of the provision of water supplies for the citizens of Gloucester from Roman times up until the middle of the 19th century. It is said that bread is the staff of life because we need to eat to live, but as or perhaps even more important than bread is water. We can live many days without food, but only a short time without water. Today, we take it for granted that all we have to do is turn on the tap and clean water instantly flows. On the rare occasion that it doesn't, we assume that the water company is not doing its job properly in supplying it to us. In many countries, of course, water is a scarce commodity, particularly in times of drought, some natural disaster, or perhaps just poor management by the governing authorities. When the Romans first came to Gloucester made their camp at Kingsholm in the 1st century, they would have had to find a suitable supply of drinking water as a high priority. This talk aims to tell the story of how our forerunners have developed the ability to harness water sources on the road to installing and maintaining today's complex water supply network in our city. I started researching this subject some years ago, but drew a number of blanks in the records, but have picked it up again more recently and in order to deliver this talk. There are still a number of blanks which hopefully I may be able to fill in time. Often those I give talks to give me feedback which helps my research into a particular topic. Of course, with my name, like a name like mine, Drinkwater, it is perhaps a natural subject for me to tackle. Let's think about water. Water is an organic compound of 2 atoms of hydrogen to 1 of oxygen. Depending on temperature and pressure, it can be in solid form, that's ice, liquid or gas, water vapor or steam. It's transparent, tasteless, colorless and odorless. It is an essential fluid for all living organisms. Water covers some 71% of the Earth's surface, 96.5% in the seas and oceans, 1.7% as groundwater, 1.7% as ice, and 0.001% as vapor in the air. It is essential to the world's economy. 70% of fresh water goes to agriculture, 6.5% into fishing in salt and fresh water. Much of traded goods travel on boats through seas, rivers, lakes and canals, and the water is used for cooling and heating in industry and homes. It is a solvent for a wide variety of substances, both mineral and organic, used for cooking, washing, and central to sports such as swimming, pleasure boating, boat racing, surfing, sport fishing, diving, ice skating and skiing. In other words, water is essential for personal survival and for civilization. But for health reasons, it needs to be potable. In other words, safe to drink without fear of disease. This talk will be under the following headings: Rome and Gloucester, springs and wells, pipelines, and the distribution of water. Before the Romans came to Britain, there were a number of Iron Age Celtic tribes in Britain. The Dobuni lived in this local area. They had hill forts up on the Cotswold Escarpment at Crickley Hill and Cranham Woods. These people would have had access to the many springs and streams flowing down to the Severn for their drinking water. The Romans' conquest of Britain started in AD 43, and after initially establishing a base at Colchester, the Roman invaders spread around the country. From a local base in Cirencester, the 20th Legion under Publius Ostorius Scapula headed towards Wales and came to the lowest crossing point of the River Severn, where they set up a campaign garrison at Kingsholm, just to the northeast of present-day Gloucester, around 47 to 49 AD. The eastern and at that time only branch of the River Severn flowed close to the line of present-day St Oswald's Road, joining the Severn near the quay. The Romans called the Severn by its Latin name of Sabrina. In my Latin lessons at school, when we listened to our teacher reading about the Romans in Britain, whenever he mentioned the Sabrina, a titter of laughter went around the classroom of us teenage boys, because Sabrina was the name of a glamour model alongside the likes of Marilyn Monroe and Diana Dawes. A statue representing Sabrina, the river, features on Scriven's Conduit, which we will meet later in this talk. As this was Dobunni territory, it is likely there would have been clashes with the locals under their leader Caractacus, so a fortified garrison close to the crossing point was needed for protection. The camp was to be the base for their military excursions into Wales, so needed to be more permanent, and they would have needed a more defendable source of drinking water supply. Now, the Romans were much more advanced in civil engineering than the local Dobunni, so it might be expected that they found a more sophisticated solution. During reconstruction of nearby Escourt Road in 1947, a stone-lined well was discovered close to the camp. The River Severn was nearby, but probably not so good for drinking. However, there are several small brooks which flow down from the Cotswold escarpment to the River Severn. At that time, the local population might have used the brooks for drinking water, as they only flowed a few miles from source to Severn, so they were unlikely to be as polluted as they are today. The nearest brooks to the garrison site are the Wootton to the north and Sudbrook to the south, which would have involved carrying water some distance to the garrison. The Romans, with their experience of building roads and waterways, came up with another solution. Now, the River Tiber flows through Abbeymead and Abbeydale, and at that time it flowed into the Sudbrook at present-day St Bridge Ponds, before passing through the cemetery and beside the Gloucester Park, then discharging into the Severn. Near the Abbeydale Community Centre, there is a water junction, where the Romans diverted the Tiber into a man-made canal to go directly to Gloucester. Now, I had always believed that the canal had been built when they had later moved up to the present site of Gleven for the freshwater supply to the new garrison there. However, in preparing this talk and studying maps and having a rethink, it seems now to me most likely that they designed it to discharge into the old original Eastern Channel, passing close to the Kingsholm garrison for their fresh water supply. Incidentally, when Abbeydale was built in the 70s, the original route of the Tiber was reinstated and once again flows into the Sud in order to reduce flooding through Gloucester when heavy rains cause the Tiber Canal to overflow. The timber-built garrison site at Kingsholm would have been subject to winter flooding, and when it was decided to be a more permanent base, a new garrison was built on the present site in around 64 AD. The old site was demolished, but later was a site of the Kingsholm Palace, again long since demolished. In around 75 AD, the army moved on, but the town then became known as Gleven, becoming a home for retired soldiers and an emerging centre of trade. The retired soldiers built housing around the city, but were kept as reserves in case the army needed them at any stage. The Driver Canal was now discharging into the Severn to the northeast of the new Gleavham site. It would now seem reasonable to assume it was at this stage that a new channel was dug to take a straighter line to the River Severn. This would run alongside the northeast side of the new Gleavham garrison. It was later called the Fullbrook and became part of the new abbey constructed on William the Conqueror's orders. Later still, Henry I granted the use of the Fullbrook for whatever the abbey wished. Now let's look at springs and wells. Technically, a spring is where water comes to the surface naturally. A well is where water is below the surface and has to be dug down into until the aquifer is reached. Often the two terms are interchangeable. There were a number of springs and wells in Gleavham, some of them still traceable today. No doubt some of these would have been found or dug by the Romans, others later by the monks and friars. They were still in wide use during the siege of Gloucester, when the king cut off the other water supplies to the city, and the population had to rely on the springs for drinking water, which was polluted by human waste products in the days before public conveniences. It was said that the water was rather sparkly. To understand why there are so many springs and wells in this area, we must look at the geology of the region. The Cotswold Escarpment near Cranham and Robertwood Hill comprises pervious limestone through which rainwater can percolate. Below this and in the valley is impervious clay. At the junction of these two geological materials, many springs appear, supplying those 7 brooks that flow down to the Severn near Gloucester. In the valley on top of the clay, gravel is also found. Water then can track down below the gravel and above the clay. Digging wells in this area gives us a supply of fresh water. I have discovered the location of more than 10 actual or possible well locations in the immediate city area and others in the near and vicinity and suburbs. Working our way down this map, let's start at the top of the map, but at the bottom of Westgate Street, where the Dukery's apartments now stand. A spring was discovered there in 1742 when a new house was being built in what was then a fashionable area of the city for the gentry. Although the first owner was not really interested in the spring and had it capped over, the house offered board and lodging, and visitors were allowed and entitled to take the water. By 1787, the then tenant found it was useless for cooking, washing and brewing, and ruined brandy. However, his wife and daughter found it provided relief from health conditions that Malvern water had failed to do. The tenant then saw a business opportunity and opened it as a spa. The water was piped into a small room. He advertised its free availability to all who needed it, and it was soon drawing some 400 people per day. He developed it then into a business. In 1788, with a pump room and 2 baths, one for the ladies, one for the gentlemen, and kept a smaller room for non-paying guests. In October 1798, the Duke of Norfolk, Charles Howard, who was a mayor of Gloucester at that time, obtained the house and it became known as Eagle House. The spa remained popular for a while, but enthusiasm faded with Cheltenham so close by. By 1850, the area was in decline and the house was divided up into shops and apartments. It fell into disrepair and was eventually left vacant. Eagle House, or the old Spa House as it was also known, was demolished in 1971 to make way for the Dukery's. built a drinking fountain in the abbey. Not there now, as you can see, but which is probably what is quite like the one in Westminster Abbey, which is an up-to-date picture there. In Westgate Street, there were probably several wells. We've already talked about the spa in Eagle House. Further up the street, whilst carrying out renovations in the Folk last year, or in 2022, I should say, a well was discovered, 8 meters deep, including 3 meters of water. It would have been in the original courtyard sometime in the 17th century before the house was extended over it. The bricks at the top of the well look Victorian, so it seemed that when the level of the floor inside the house was raised, the well was capped off. When rediscovered, the water was found to be clear and tasted palatable. The well is now featured, displayed in the house. Further up Westgate Street, there was Trinity Well, surmounted by a cross near the presently named Fountain Inn in this 1455 map. There was a well in Northgate Street, somewhere near the North Gate, but unfortunately I found no evidence of it now or documentation as to exactly where it was. There may have been a spring in St John's Lane, formerly called Gray's Alone, feeding water to the Cathedral Gardens, which the water bailiffs were given access to via Maverdine Lane. The slide shows the same locations, but on an older map. There might have been Roman baths at the top end of Westgate Street, which too could have been fed from such a spring. But this is just interesting speculation. No archaeological or documentary evidence has been found for this spring. This is an artist's expression of where the baths might have been and what they may have looked like. Very grand. There is another well in Cafe Rennie in Marylebone, next to St Mary the Crypt Church. This one may have been constructed and used by the Romans, but more recent brickwork has been added at a later date. It still has water at the bottom of it and is a prominent feature in the cafe. The modern-day structure erected in 2011 represents a probable well called St Kinniburg's in Kimbrough Square near the site of the old South Gate. The story goes that Kinniburgh was a young noble lady who escaped to Gloucester to avoid an unwanted marriage. Here she worked for a local baker who took her under his wing like an adopted daughter, which upset his jealous wife. One day when the baker was out, his wife killed Kinniburgh, chopped off her head and threw it down the nearby well. When the baker came home and called Kinniburgh's name, her voice came up from the well. This unlikely story gave rise to her sainthood and a chapel being erected over the well in her name. The chapel came under the care of the nearby Black Friars, who probably used the well for their drinking water supply. After the dissolution of the monasteries under Henry VIII, the friary was purchased by Sir Thomas Bell, who converted the chapel into an almshouse called St Kinniburgh. In June 2018, an archaeological examination was undertaken by Cotswold Archaeology on land adjacent to 19 to 21 Brunswick Road. One trench was excavated. A ditch and a potable well dating to the earlier part of the Roman period was identified. This would have been just outside the Roman Glevon walls, where there is also evidence of a burial site. There are 3 wells in Spa Road. The first, dug in 1749, was in the garden of a private house called St Luke's House, later known as Waterloo Villa. It was dug to provide a water supply for the house, but was found to be a chalybeate, or iron well, with medicinal properties. The second, dug in 1762, was a saline well, salt tasting well, and the third in 1814 was a sulphur well with a depth of 85 feet. This was on land known as Rignor Stile, owned by Sir James Jelf, a local banker and Mayor of Gloucester. A pump house was erected with a verandah and a decorated parapet facing up Brunswick Road. The pump drew water from all three wells. The new spa became very popular. It offered hot and cold vapour treatment in 4 separate bathrooms. Landscaped walkways were laid out in the surrounding land. Unfortunately, the business failed and was sold for auction to John Philpotts, who formed the Gloucester Spa Company. There was a grand opening on May the 1st, 1815. He then set out to develop the surrounding area to become a fashionable part of Gloucester, including grand houses in Spa Road, the Spa Hotel, Brunswick Square and Christchurch in Brunswick Road. The spa was at its most fashionable in the 1820s, but was increasingly overshadowed by the growth of the fashionable health resort of Cheltenham. In 1862, with activities slowing down, the spa was offered to the City Council for inclusion in the public park, which became the present-day Gloucester Park. The pump room baths fell into disrepair and were removed in 1894. The springs were finally closed in 1926 following contamination, and the pump rooms finally demolished in 1960. All that remains today is a plaque on the fence by the cricket green. We now look at the sites of 2 more wells outside the range of the map that we have been using. The first is the Tull Well, of Roman origin just outside the original Roman garrison at Kingsholm. This was discovered when the Escort Road bypass was under construction in 1947, and the well was dated to around 50 to 60 AD. The name is shown on this 792 map. In a 1980s dig in Kingsholm Square, a well shaft was discovered which dated to the post-medieval period, so might have been the Tull Well with added brickwork or another well in the same area. The second is Wells Springs in present-day Long Levens. Now, I found no documentary evidence that there were springs here, but why would it be named thus if there weren't? The name is shown on this old OS map for a farm and cottages. Both have long since gone, but Wells Springs Estate was built in the 1930s and Wells Springs Road exists today. Another well called Goosewhite Well is mentioned in the archives, providing water for the White Friars. We'll talk about that later. But no exact location is given. However, on this map, we see that Millbrook Street used to be called Goosewhite Lane. The brook would be the Twyver, where it crossed under Millbrook Street. There was also a medieval mill there, and later on in Victorian times, in 1873, an open-air swimming pool. So it seemed likely there would have been a spring here, which might have fed into the Twyver, and from which the Whitefriars sourced their freshwater supply. We'll come back to how they might have got it to the friary later in this talk. Now, further outside the city, in the suburbs, there are 4 wells, one at Matson, at least 2 on Robertswood Hill, and the Holy Well at Hempstead. Close to Matson Lane, between St Catherine's Church and the Dry Ski Centre, there is a spring which emits red-coloured water and feeds a pond. This is known as a chalybeate well, from the Latin word chalybe, meaning iron, as the water contains iron salts, hence the red colour and metallic taste. Let me show you a video now. I'm trying to find the red well at Matson. I've come off Matson Lane to the ski centre, I'm following some instructions on this bit of paper I have in my hand, which you can't see. I'm following this track down here, and lo and behold, there are some green railings, and inside the railings there is a well, and that's the Matson red well. It is in fact red colour because that's the oxygen, the iron content of the water. And it's called a shallow beach well, and it feeds, the well feeds down into this lake just down here. That noise is a big tank on my left hand side. Be careful not to fall in. And there's the water flowing down into the pond. It is claimed that such wells, technically of course this is actually a spring, have healing properties, and rags were hung on overhanging trees to emphasize this, giving rise to the name rag wells and sometimes holy wells. Another name for this well is Edith Spring, after a legend concerning Edith, a young Saxon noble lady from Upton St Leonards who married an earl and gave birth to a son. The earl was killed fighting for King Harold, and Edith, fearing for her life and the life of her son by the invading Normans seeking revenge, climbed up Matson Hill, bent on killing herself and her son. As she dug a grave, red spring water arose. Seeing this as a miraculous sign, she dedicated herself to holy living, and she and her son became anchorites, withdrawing from secular society and leading intensely prayer-oriented ascetic lives. Spring feeds a pond and a sandstone trough, no longer there, by the side of Matson Lane, which probably provided fresh water for nearby Matson House and also in the pass. I believe this reservoir it was one of those providing water for Gloucester and was sourced from another spring, which we don't know where it is or was, on the hill. And this reservoir has long been filled in. There are two known wells on the lower north-facing slopes of Robinswood Hill, where rainwater falling on top of the hill percolates through the limestone and emerges where it meets the clay. The well house, or Monk's Well, is at 300 foot, 91 metres, gradient. It is built with limestone blocks with a metal grid protecting the opening. It is now overgrown, but water still flows down the hill. The well cross is lower down at 200 feet, or 61 metre elevation, and like its neighbour, the limestone housing is protected by a metal grid, but is surrounded by an iron fence. It is also fairly overgrown. I think it's possible that water from Monk's Well flowed down the hill, it still does, and fed the well cross, and a small cistern or reservoir, which is no longer there, to supply Gloucester with fresh waters, the first move of that kind. There is a well on the western slope of a low hill at Hempstead, and again another little video that I'd like to show you. And here is the well, or at least the well house. It doesn't have any writing on it, but obviously what went on here, the use of this well warranted putting a fairly substantial structure. But now all there is to see is really a bit of a muddy pond underneath where the water comes out of a spring and disappears into the undergrowth down towards the council tip and assumably the River Severn. There was at one time a Roman camp here overlooking and guarding the southern approach to Roman Glevum. The spring probably provided water for the Roman soldiers 13 centuries before the well house was built. Traditionally, it is believed that the well-built limestone well house in the form of a small chapel was constructed in the early 14th century by the canons of nearby Lantony Secundra. It is called My Lady's Well, dedicated to either St Mary or St Mary's mother, St Anne, hence the title, Holy Well. The water is said to have had healing properties, and the well would have been a place of pilgrimage. In early local folklore, there is a legend that the Virgin Mary was on her way to visit Joseph of Arimathea at Glastonbury when her boat washed up on the River Severn on the Bore, a beach nearby. She climbed up the slope from the river and discovered the spring. Like most legends, there is probably little truth in this tale. Note the 50-foot contour line above which is a surprisingly small catchment area for rainwater, which must have fed the spring. Now look at pipe water. When some years ago I worked in Nepal, and we had language training, and we had to visit a local house, and we found in the village there was no water supply, but they had, as they all over Nepal do, have a well or a spring which feeds a tap. And every morning the ladies come down from the hill where they lived above, up the catchment area of the well, of course, and with all their pots and pans, and filled them with water and lugged them all the way up the hill. And they did this every day. They didn't have the advantage that we have today of hot and cold, or at least cold, running water on tap. Phil Moss thinks the Romans could have been the first to pipe water down from Robertswood Hill, as during a 1966 dig in Bell Lane, some pipe fittings were uncovered, possibly for a water pipe leading to the Roman Basilica in what is now Southgate Street. In the Roman section of the museum in Brunswick Road, there is a short length of lead pipe, which I understand was discovered at the top of Westgate Street. As this is some way from Bell Lane, it may have been part of the pipe from Robbinswood or part of a later distribution system around the city. The next recorded mention of piped water comes from centuries later, when the religious houses constructed their buildings in Gloucester. These were fairly self-contained. For the occupants to live and go about their business, they needed a reliable source of water. In the abbey, then, with their order of monks, the order of monks was rebuilt on the present site of the orders of William the Conqueror. The original abbey, of course, a bit further down, diverting some of the water to serve. William the Conqueror in 1089 then built the abbey, which is now called the cathedral. He granted them permission to tap into the Fulbrook, diverting some of the water to serve their domestic purposes and to drive their mill. Later this was confirmed by Henry I, who granted them the use of the Fulbrook for whatever they wished. As we saw earlier, drinking water was obtained from a well in the Cloister Garth, but this was probably insufficient to meet their needs. The first documented mention of pipe water came in the early 13th century, when the aforementioned sacrist Helius, or Ellis of Hereford, constructed a conduct of living water, a system of piped drinking water which brought water from the spring on Robbinswood Hill. This supplied the 14th century lavatorium in the North Cloister Walk, probably a pre-existing version also with a multi-foil basin, the remains of which were found in the Cloister Garth in around 1890. This was still in use in the 17th century. The owner of the spring The owner of the springs on Robinswood Hill, William Gerald, a tenant of the abbey, granted the right to take water and build a reservoir. This permission was confirmed by a later owner, Philip, son of Philip of Matson. Now, we don't know exactly the route of this pipe, but this map shows a straight line from Robinswood Hill Reservoir to the southeast corner of the city walls near the Greyfriars Priory Garden to the present-day Brunswick Road. As this partly follows the line of the present Stroud Road, it is likely to be close to the actual path. We don't know where the abbey's pipe went from there, but possibly just outside the city in the Goose Ditch. This is different Goose Ditch to the one in Millbrook Street. And this took to the northeast corner of the city, and then the city walls, then from there into the abbey. There was some credence of this as the early 17th century, in the 17th century, the tenant of the Ram Inn in Northgate Street, beneath which is a pipeline ran, served as the aqueductor with responsibility for maintaining the pipeline and the warehouse on the hill. The friars came to Gloucester later. Greyfriars in 1231, Blackfriars in 1239, and Whitefriars in 1268. William Gerard, or the later owner Philip, also granted rights of the springs to the Franciscans Greyfriars in Gloucester. This led to a dispute with the abbey over who should have the water. It was resolved by the Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, who later became Edward II. He came to Gloucester in 1357 to personally act as mediator. He recognised the sad straits of the friars for their lack of water and ordered the abbey to give them the right to a pipe 1/3 the size of the abbey's, and this should be conveyed in a leaden pipe. There is little documentary evidence for the other religious houses with regard to their water supplies. The Augustinian canons came in 1235 and built Lantini Secunda in Hempstead alongside the Sudbrook. This was used to drive a mill, but whether it was clean enough to drink is another question. As it is a short distance from the Lady Well, it may have been constructed at the end of the 14th century to the priory, by the priory to supply it with clean, fresh drinking water. Blackfriars Priory was in the city itself and was close to Kinneberg's well, which they probably used for drinking. St Oswald's was close to the old eastern branch of the Severn. The Twyver Fulbrook flowed close by on the downstream side of the abbey, taking its surplus, probably polluted water with it. As regards fresh water, a document dated the 13th century, 1263 to 84, states that the abbey supplied living water, aqua viva, which was a surplus to the requirements of the lavatorium. But how did it get there? Water distribution. So the monks and friars were catered for, but the ordinary citizens had to be content with wells until the first recorded documentation concerning pipe water for the citizens of Gloucester dated 1438, when the Greyfriars granted the right of the community to 3/4 of their pipe water from Robbinswood Hill. The agreement between the friars and the community was couched in rather quaint language. The friars, on account of their affection towards the community of Gloucester, and with the assent of Father Richard Leake, their provincial minister, grant to the said bailiffs and community 3/4 of their water, running in a leaden pipe in the ground from the hill called Matters Knoll to the garden of the said convent within the walls of the said town. From the Greyfriars Garden, then, the water was divided into 4 parts, one part kept by the friars and the other 3 parts piped in a leaden pipe to the High Cross and in other places. The pipework from Robbinswood Hill would be maintained by the friars, but the community would be responsible for 3/4 of the cost of repairs. The High Cross, or Altar Crux, at the junction of the Gate Streets, was probably constructed in the early 13th century. It was 35 foot high with a cross on the top. At some time it had niches around the circumference containing the statues of monarchs who had particular association with Gloucester. The earliest sketch of it appears in 1455 and shows taps and pipes, indicating that by then the water was being piped to the cross in accordance with the Greyfriars Agreement. The High Cross was taken down in 1751, as it was considered an obstruction to carriages. The other places mentioned in the Friars' Agreement were not named, but they were also conduits by the St Mary de Grace and Holy Trinity churches in Westgate Street and Scriven's Conduit. Following Henry VIII's dissolution in 1538, the Greyfriars site was used as a brewery, taking advantage of the ready supply of water from Robbinswood. In 1634, John Scrivens built a conduit at the southern end of the Wheat Market in Southgate Street, by present-day Bell Lane, and tapped into the pipe leading to the High Cross. This structure was in place until 1784, when it was removed and put in a field in what is now 24 Clarence Street, then moved out to Edgeworth Manor, and finally returned to Gloucester in 1938, when it can be seen in a modified form in Hillview Gardens in London Road. Gradually, others joined the pipe network. The larger pipes were made of wood and lead pipes tapped into them. This is a section of wooden pipe now on display in the Folk. Plumbers were employed to maintain the pipes. The name plumber comes from the Latin word for lead, plumbum. As well as pipe work, they will also be used for work on the lead roofs and windows of the buildings. During the siege of Gloucester in 1643, the king's men cut off the supply from Robbinswood Hill, and the citizens had to revert to the use of the springs and wells. It was restored again after the siege ended. Although the conduits supplied water free to the citizens of Gloucester, they were locked up at 9 p.m. each night from 25th of March until 29th of September, and at 8 p.m. for the rest of the year, and unlocked between 5 a.m. and 6 a.m. in the summer months, and 7 a.m. till 8 a.m. or 8 p.m. I should say, in the winter. This was the responsibility of Thomas Barnes, the plumber, employed in 1647 to maintain the pipes. Locking up the conduits brought strong disapproval from the population, and the order was rescinded 3 years later. After Thomas Barnes came Thomas Nichols, who was given a grant for life to mend and repair all the pipes from Robbinswood Hill to the various conduits and lay new lead as required. After the Civil War, it was evident that the supplies from Robbinswood Hill were insufficient to meet the demand. So in 1692, a report recommended that water be supplied from the River Severn. Thomas Nichols was then commissioned to build a pumping station below Westgate Bridge. The water was pumped up Westgate Street in wooden pipes to the King's Board, where it supplied water to a cistern of 1,000 gallons capacity, which was installed in 1705 on the top of the structure. The pump was replaced by a larger one in 1702. It was still in operation in 1743, but the pumping station was dismantled in 1759. The King's Board was taken down in 1780 because it was considered an obstruction to traffic, and moved first to Barton Street, then Tiverton, and finally in 1938 to join Scriven's Conduit in Hillview Gardens, where it remains today. By the early 18th century, the population of Gloucester was around 5,000. The supply from the Severn and the spring water from Robbinswood Hill was insufficient to meet the needs of the inhabitants. However, the fact that the Robbinswood water was of good quality and was fed to the city by gravity, it was decided to improve the supply, and in 1740 an Act of Parliament was passed stating, whereas the inhabitants of the city of Gloucester suffer many inconveniences for want of being supplied with a sufficient quantity of good and pure water, the present method of supplying the city with water having been found ineffectual, and he went on to outline proposals for a reservoir at Robbinswood Hill and new pipes to be laid into the city. In 1741, a deed was sealed by the corporation, and John Selwyn, the owner of the land on which the springs now are situated, within a few years a reservoir had been built and a new wooden mains pipe laid into the city. Individual supplies were connected by lead pipes and a charge levied by Mr. Selwyn. In 1745 there were 145 customers or consumers. A further reservoir close to the first was constructed by 1799, and in the plan of 1835 3 are shown. Earthenware pipes were laid between the springs and the reservoirs. In 1832 the population of the city had risen to 11,933, and Selwyn's works became inadequate. In 1836 another act was passed and the Gloucester Water Company was formed by 6 directors. The Act allowed for the supplies to be taken to surrounding parishes and the construction of 2 reservoirs. Additional collecting pipes were laid around the north side of Robbinswood Hill, which obtained a yield of 70,000 gallons per day and were fed into the reservoirs. Note the Matson Red Well is not included, probably because of the iron discolouring the water. The main pipe from the reservoirs crossed the fields to the Stroud Road and then into Southgate Street below the old General Hospital and up to the Cross. In 1838, confirmation of the success of the company came with an article in the Gloucester Journal about a fire in Northgate Street. In July, it said, "Few towns in the kingdom have such a facility of obtaining water as this city has at present, owing to the spirited and useful undertaking of the Gloucester Water Company." Gloucester Journal, July 1838. But by 1850, the population of Gloucester had reached 17,572, and with a deterioration in sanitary conditions causing epidemics of cholera, typhoid, and typhus, once again the existing provision of water from Robbinswood Hill was in question. A petition from a group of medical practitioners were calling for a constant supply of water at pressure. The days of supplying local, cheap, clean and easily conveyed water from Robbinswood Hill were numbered. It was time to look further afield for water sources and storage facilities, with the added difficulties of delivering it to the city. My brief for this talk was to tell the stories of Gloucester's ancient water supplies, and I trust I've now brought you up to this point. But the situation today is different. When every home in Gloucester has access to a safe and reliable supply of water courtesy at a cost, of course, to the Severn Trent Water Authority established in 1974. But this will need another talk to take it further. If I have stimulated anyone to carry on the work of the story, telling the story, I will be happy to pass on my research and offer my help and encouragement to you. Thank you for listening.